Hello, everybody. I'm Will Tagle, and one part of the teaching team of this great books course. And I'm privileged today for those of you who are joining us through this Wisdom School Ubiquity webinar. I'm privileged to be able to connect with Ann Baring. And I want to say just a word or two before we get started about the format, before I link to Ann. If you'll note at the bottom of your Zoom viewer there, you'll see the word chat. If you'll move the cursor down to chat, and right away, when you click on that, you'll see that Ruth Schroeder has said, "Good morning, Will, great to see you." And I'm monitoring the chat as well as talking with Ann, so I won't be adding much on the chat, but I want to encourage all of you to express yourselves in the chat, because Ann and I are going to be talking. The usual format is for the presenter to lecture for about an hour or so and then have interaction with our larger participants. But today, Ann and I have hatched this notion of conversation between the two of us about her book. And I want to expand it to include all of you today. And that I see Diane Browsey has made a comment, and also Joyce Dillon has made a comment. Now let me see if I can bring up here the participants. Yeah, there, I got it. So I want to acknowledge a few. I see Dr. Joy from over there in Atlanta, Georgia. So Joy, good to see you. And Farnak, gosh, I don't know where you are right now. I think somewhere in Europe, Farnak. And I see Margit, I think she's from Germany. I see Steve from Kansas. So I really, really appreciate your willingness to join with Ann and me in a robust response. And as Ann interacts with me, mainly Ann, because you're here to basically draw on her brilliance, feel free to make comments, raise questions, and so on in the chat. So enough of that for this morning. I want to call your attention to this book. If you'll see, if you'll see, here is my response to this book. Jim has talked quite a bit about what constitutes a great book. And his observations are quite astute and relevant. I want to push it a bit further for a moment and say that for me, in this day and time of climate change and transition, a great book is one that points us in the direction of the bridge of the moving from the old story to the new story, from the old understanding of the separation between humans and our habitats toward a new role of humans with a new earth. And that is a lot of what we will experience today. And so, in that regard, when it came time, back when I was dean with the Wisdom School, when it came time to select great books, two came to my mind in a vision in the night. One was Rachel Carson, and the other was Anne Baring's book, The Dream of the Cosmos. And my thinking about that is that The Dream of the Cosmos is a great book, not only a good book, not only a book to be read, but one of the crucial books of our era. And I hope that you will spend time again and again, read, mark, and inwardly digest. There are some books that you can order on Kindle or Amazon and read electronically, and that's a fine way just to get a taste of this book. But this is the kind of book that you really need to read, mark, and inwardly digest. So Anne is, as Jim has said, one of the great thinkers of our time. In addition to that, I believe Anne is a bridge person, having a mother and grandmother who are American and father who is European. And so Anne has spent time living in the United States during a crucial formative period that we'll get into in a moment, but also representative of the deep earth emerging in Europe. And in that way, Anne, yeah, she's a Jungian analyst. Yes, she's written other books that are very important. But for our purposes today, I want to introduce her as a prophet of the new story. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Will. What a lovely introduction.
Yes, and now you're coming to us from a UK that is right now in a heat wave.
Not only that, it's in a crisis, a governmental crisis. So, yeah. And also the football, we've got the football coming up tomorrow.
So you've got a lot going on there.
Well, the triple whammy.
Yeah. Well, let's start. I would like to orient us to you and to your vision by starting with the out-of-body experience that you describe early in your book. If you would link us into that domain.
Yes, well, strangely enough, just in talking to you, I said that happened in New Hampshire when I was 11 years old, when I was staying the summer there with some friends of my mother's. And rushing noise, not knowing what had happened or where I was going. And that went on for quite some seconds until I was spewed out into this dark immensity at the other end of the tunnel. And as I sort of came to, as it were, I heard two words, just I am. Now, whether all I was supposed to hear, whether no, but I got too frightened and I went back into the channel and back into my body and woke up in my bed. But that was so important because it showed me that there are two dimensions. There's just the dimension of this world, but another dimension that I entered just briefly, and that if I hadn't been so frightened, I would have stayed in longer. And I had a channeled message afterwards because my mother received these messages from about 1942 onwards. And it said that I'd been an advanced medium in other lives and that I would be a medium later on as I grew older in this life. And that I had something to do in this life, something to accomplish. So that was a very great formative influence on my early life.
Yeah, well, I think that's really to the point. Now, you had this vision as an 11-year-old, and you were in New Hampshire visiting. But of great importance is you and your mother talked about this.
Absolutely, because I didn't really know about these messages until I had this experience. And then obviously she held back, thinking that it would be too much for a child. But then she told me that they'd been receiving these not for very long, maybe 6 months or something. And so I became a participant in them from then on, occasionally, not all the time, maybe one every 3 or 4 years. I was allowed to read them. And what for this present time that we're in, that I've put it on my website, what the messages said. It's under channeled messages on my website.
Right. Well, that's another point I think people would do well to consider, and that is your marvelous website. And I really like that you've got a section on your website on channeled messages.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've written about the daytime Jung, Carl Jung, and the nighttime Jung, and those were often separate kinds of communication. And we didn't get his red book really until decades really after his death because of this split. But right away, you have this nighttime Anne Baring and daytime Anne Baring together, and not only together, but on your website. And when Dan sends this out, I'll have him put a reference to your website.
Thank you. Yes, that would be helpful.
So
because half of my book is on the website, or at least the extension of the book is on the website, which is huge and a bit daunting, but it's got lots of things which would interest people, I'm sure.
So let's talk for a moment about that time when you were here in North America. So you were here in North America, and that was in 1942 or 3, somewhere along in there.
That's right, yes, because my grandmother being American, at the beginning of the war, my parents decided to send my brother and myself over to her care, which we did. And I'll just tell you a funny story, because being who she wasn't going to pay any attention to the war. So she took us all back, if you please, to France in 1940, just before the Germans invaded France. And we had to get out in a hurry. And I had appendicitis just at the point when we were leaving. And I had to just go immediately after the operation on a train to Italy and get on a boat back to America. So my grandmother's little venture, unfortunately, had to be cut short. But you can see the kind of character that she was from that description.
Right. Then you and I were talking earlier about that when you came here, you spent time in New York and in New England, but also in New Mexico.
That's right. I spent about 9 months in New Mexico and Arizona, and I had a marvelous time there because I had an Indian guide who took me to the reservations, the Navajo reservations, and I spent a lot of time there. I don't remember, unfortunately, but I remember the feeling of riding with him to these reservations, and on a wonderful horse, a brown and white horse, which galloped like the wind. And it was just so exciting for a 10-year-old child to do this extraordinary experience while my mother was looking after my younger sister, who was quite ill with tuberculosis, or she'd had bovine tuberculosis, not the chest kind. So that was a wonderful sort of experience, as well as other parts of America that I visited and got to know quite well. And then I had a very good school in New York called Spence School, which had a wonderful education. And I went there for 2 or 3 years.
Right. Well, I want to linger for just a moment on your time in Arizona and New Mexico, because it immediately preceded this remarkable linkage, but as an 11-year-old, with the unknown, the dimension in shamanic worlds we call the upper and the lower world. And you link there. And I wonder if you had given some thought through the years that the landscape in Arizona and New Mexico with your American Indian guide and the horse itself, if in some ways that had opened the door to this out-of-body experience.
Well, I hadn't thought of that, but now that you mention it, that experience was a kind of calling, a shamanic calling, if you like, or shamanic experience, and possibly the connection with the Indians had opened the door to that, and with the guide. Yeah,
Right.
I hadn't thought of that, but it's an interesting observation of yours.
Yeah, in some ways, I note you were just 17 years behind Carl Jung in your visit there.
Really? Yeah,
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that either. Mm.
Yeah, so if you think this little obscure place, Taos, New Mexico, Santa Fe, and so on, is a landscape, a set of ecofields that is sending forth visions and calling people to open themselves to be a link between humans and the deeper earth habitat.
Mm.
And here you are, a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, and you are selected by the landscape to be its voice.
That's a lovely idea. Thank you. Lovely.
And the voice is, I am.
I am. And
Yeah.
that holds so much. Those two words hold everything that one needs to know and everything one needs to discover in them. Didn't need any more words.
Well, then your life unfolded, and you among other things, were in Jungian analysis, and you were talking with your analyst, Hella Adler.
Adler, yeah.
Yeah. And you made a comment to her that seemed very significant in the context of our conversation here.
Well, I'd been reading a book on shamanism, and it suddenly just struck me. I'm being trained to be a shaman. This is what Jungian analysis is about. And I didn't really think of Jung then as a shaman, but of course that's what he was. And that, in a way, is what I've become, a bridge builder between two dimensions of life.
Right. So these are my terms, not yours. But in my initial doctorate, I focused quite a bit on Carl Jung, so I know quite at least some about him, and also his training. And I consider you, more than any other person I've talked to or read, to understand the spirit of Carl Jung.
Well, I hope I do. I've always felt very close to his way of thinking. And every time I read one of his books when I was depressed or feeling I didn't know what to do, that immediately put me in touch with my deeper self. And I felt refreshed and inspired, really, every time I opened whatever book it was. And in fact, I remember the first one my husband read to me when I was in hospital, which was Modern Man in Search of a Soul. Mm-hmm. So that really started me off with reading Jung long before I had the analysis.
Right. And then eventually you became a Jungian analyst.
That's right. A 7-year training, long training.
Yeah. So what has it been like for you to say, hey, I think I'm becoming a shaman in the context of being a Jungian analyst? What's that been like for you?
Well, it's just taken its own path, really. I haven't thought about it specifically. I did the Jungian training because I was very interested in it, and I was interested in the whole philosophy behind it, and I needed it anyway because I had 2 long analyses, one with a man for 11 years, and then 11 years with Hella Adler. So that's 22 years of analysis. And I remember reading somewhere that often it takes 10 or 20 years for an analysis to bear fruit. And I think with my case, it probably took 40 or 50 years. It's coming out now. But because immediately I didn't know quite what to do after I'd finished my training. Obviously, I practiced as an analyst, but I didn't feel fulfilled, and I didn't feel I was really helping people at a deep level. And it wasn't until I began to write Myth of the Goddess, why I forget it, yes, Evolution of an Image. It wasn't until I began to write that with Jules Cashford that I really began to come into my own and realize who I was and what I was supposed to be doing on this planet. I had to be a writer, and I had to communicate with people, and I had to understand what I was communicating first and then put it in a form that people could understand. And all that I learned through writing that book, The Myth of the Goddess, with Jules. It took us 10 years to write while we were training as analysts. So it was a huge kind of subsidiary effort, if you like, on both our parts. And we're still great friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the end of that, I realized that I hadn't really completed the work. I had to do something else. And so the next 20 years were devoted to finding out what that else was, lecturing on the Myth of the Goddess, but also developing my own ideas further, and the connection with the shamanic cultures and that whole side of life, really. So there was a lot going on.
Right. There really 4 or 5 great traditions that feed into the new shamanism. One is the what I call the transordinary state facilitators, like Michael Harner. Then there are the more traditional medicine people, shaman, like my friend and teacher Berhart, who have a different perspective, but similar. And then there's the perspective that you and I come from, and I'll lump myself in with you if I could for just a moment. And that is childhood experiences that are transordinary, that eventuate in personal psychotherapy and also training as a psychologist, as a psychotherapist. And it raises the question in our day of the role of psychological work in preparing us to this larger perspective that you're calling shamanic. So I wonder what your thoughts are about the necessity of doing this tough psychological work in order to prepare us for the larger story.
Well, in my own case, it was absolutely essential. If I hadn't had that, I wouldn't have become what I am, because it gave me the training, and it gave me the connection to soul, which I'd lacked before because I didn't know what soul was. And it gave me the intellectual training as well. So I had a sort of double level, as it were, that both the soul connection and the intellectual training of reading a great many books and doing papers and all that kind of thing, which one had to do. So as well as taking trainees and learning the craft of being an analyst. So all that was very important for the formation of a complete human being, I think. It's very difficult in the culture that we live in now to get that depth without having some kind of analysis, preferably with a Jungian. But it then has to be a special sort of Jungian too. Not every Jungian can communicate this depth to the analysand. And I was extremely lucky in having both a man originally and then a woman who could communicate that depth. That the 11 years with a man were really dealing with my life problems and how to become a better wife and become a mother and not go completely off the rails, with knowing how to hold what I was trying to bring through. When I wasn't ready, I didn't have the framework to bring it through into. So that was what the analysis did. It gave me the framework. And I'm eternally grateful for that time that I spent with Hella Adler. And she really initiated me into the feminine. I remember writing 40 pages once about it and showing it to her in a great burst of outpouring of what the feminine was and could be. That was probably after I'd had the great dream of the cosmic woman.
Yeah. So I'll be interested in the chat box. What those of you who are participating, we have about 25 people participating this morning. What is your experience in doing the psychological work to open you to these larger dimensions that Anne is experiencing and writing about? So the subtitle of your book is A Quest for the Soul. And you just mentioned the soul work that you've been doing. So tell us, have you, in the quest of the soul, what have you discovered about the soul?
Well, it's all in my book, and the book is a process of discovery. It describes really going from phase to phase how that understanding of the soul developed. But it wasn't, the channel messages said over and over again, find the stone at the foot of the tree and look for the dream of the water. Now, we had no idea what that meant. In fact, my mother and my aunt used to dig a lot under lots of trees trying to find the stone buried at the bottom of the tree. But gradually it dawned on us that it was a state of being or a state of mind that they were referring to, not a physical thing in the physical world, but a state of being in the soul world, really. So gradually we understood and we grew. That was our initiation, actually, growing into a deeper understanding of what these messages were saying. So I didn't understand the meaning of the stone at the foot of the tree until I studied Kabbalah later on, much later on, in fact, after the analysis. And there you have the stone, which is the feminine principle, the Shekinah, at the foot of the tree, which is the domain of Malkuth, our kingdom here, this world. She dwells in this world with us. And that was a revelation to me, that really was. So I had these shivery-making revelations from time to time, sometimes connected with dreams, like the dream of the cosmic woman, and sometimes just discovering through what I was reading, it suddenly struck me, good God, this is what it means in relation to the soul and the presence of spirit in this world. That was the great understanding I came to, that spirit was not in the far distant sky, but was actually present in every atom of this earth. And that came partly through Kabbalah, and partly through studying The Alchemist later on, and partly through Jung, and partly through the experiences that I've had and the understanding that has gradually grown in me. So it's a long process, but a steadily opening one, or a steadily growing one, into a wider understanding and appreciation of what being alive on this planet means, and what is it asking of every single one of us.
So you mentioned something there that in the shamanic tradition, we talk about soul loss and soul retrieval. And the important dimension of what you're really leading us into as we talk is in this notion of the split between spirit and matter, or spirit and earth. So talk to us a little bit about your journey in bridging those two dimensions that have been split.
Well, it's been a long journey, but the first inkling of it really came, I think, when I was at university, and I just felt something was very wrong with the way things were being taught. And also it came through my Protestant upbringing and going to church and absolutely hating church, feeling ill and sick in it every time I went. Because in school in England, you had to go to school every Sunday, and sometimes even more. And I always felt ill, and I wondered why, and where did this emphasis on sin and guilt come from? Where did it originate? So that was one aspect. But the other aspect was, as I studied more and more, I began to see that the Christianity had put all the emphasis on the transcendence of God, and none whatsoever on the immanence of God. And I wondered why this was. And so this was the split, really, between spirit and nature that I came across earlier on and kind of noticed, but didn't quite consciously focus on. It wasn't until I began to write the myth of the goddess that this became more and more apparent, and also very clear when it became apparent, which was about 4,000 years ago, not very recently, 4,000 years, when you had the building of the great empires in the Middle East. You had the movement of peoples all over, and you had the coming of the northern tribes down from between the Caspian and the Black Seas, coming from the Russian steppes, bringing a totally different cosmology with them, which destroyed and upset the older cosmology of the Great Mother, which had prevailed for many, many thousands of years all over Europe and possibly most of the world. So all these discoveries that Jules and I made showed that there was a fundamental separation between spirit and nature that had, as it were, infected the patriarchal religions. And I will use that word deliberately. Because that is where the loss of soul has come from in all those traditions, and the loss of soul today when we think that we can master nature and have control over nature and dominate nature. All this comes from mistaken notions of belief long, long ago, and also the actual habits of behavior which led us to conquer other tribes, other peoples, other cities. And the Middle East was in turmoil, just as it's in today, 4,000 years ago, with people moving to conquer this, that, or the other people, and take them into slavery. So all that history shows the actual manifestation of the split, which infiltrated human consciousness around that time and has stayed with us ever since, and is what we now are addressing in trying to heal that split, heal all the methods of behavior, the habits of behavior, heal the mistaken beliefs, and give us a new story which could inspire the whole planet and lift everybody on it into a new level of understanding, leaving behind the old stories as being valid for their time perhaps, but leading us astray. And I don't include the teaching of Christ in that, because the teaching of Christ is still absolutely relevant today. But it's been lost in the emphasis on belief rather than transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I've said enough.
No, that's great. That's great. And so in some sense, I'll leave it to you and Jim to talk about the connecting this Nietzschean notion of the death of God and what belief system that is attending to. I want to focus though for a moment on how I love what you said there, that this was a global infection that Claire W. Graves calls a viral infection, a meme. And the meme was rampant in the Abrahamic religions and also in scientific reductionism that we'll get to in a moment. But I want to focus for just a fair amount of time on your brilliant insights into Plato, about page 99 or 100 for those of you who are following this in the book. So let's talk a little bit about how Plato led us in deeper into this virus, this split within our being.
Well, it's very difficult to talk about Plato, and if I hadn't read Peter Kingsley's book on Parmenides, I would never have understood where Plato went wrong, because Parmenides kept the connection with the deep ground, the shamanic connection, if you like, by going into these periods of incubation in which he received instruction from the inner realms about how to govern his city. And the people like him did that. They brought back the laws with which to govern their cities. But with Plato, you have the emphasis not on the shamanic experience, but in a way, about the ideal situation, if you like, or the ideal of pursuing truth and beauty, but without the means of doing so. I think he left out the actual technology of how to reach these great heights of visionary experience, if you like. And also he put very great emphasis on the spiritual, as it were, but not enough on the body really the body was, with its passions and its difficulties and its instincts, was really put down in relation to mind. And of course, all the people who followed Plato picked up the emphasis on mind, and that's why we've got the emphasis today on the rational intellect. But Plato didn't mean that at all. He actually meant the visionary imagination, I think. But because he left out the instinctual side, it got split off again. So you have the mind split off from instinct. Does that make sense?
Yes,
I don't know whether I actually said what I've said in my book, but I do remember that Peter Kingsley and Parmenides helped me to understand that. And also reading a wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist that I recommend to all of you. He understood that this had happened too. And then because of the emphasis on Plato and the rational mind, which he didn't mean by the word nous at all, but that's the way it was interpreted. We've come to put all the emphasis on the mind and to leave out the soul and, and the body. So we have to reconnect all these three with each other now. That's the great task of reconnecting them and rescuing the body from the neglect and the contempt with which it was held in Christianity, and restoring it to its place as the temple of the soul. And anyway, one can't blame Plato because he was of his time and a great genius and a marvelous writer, and I love reading his work. But I do find there is this split there between mind and the natural instinct, or the body, if you like.
Right. I think we're pretty facile at noticing how in the Abrahamic religions there's this split between the immanent divine and the transcendent. But you're pointing out in your book, and so clearly now as you talk about it, is that we often overlook this Platonic fascination with the ideal, with an unwillingness to go deeply into the primal. And it reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about earlier in some of the spirituality of the 20th century, the latter 20th century. There was this notion of great altered state experience, transordinary experiences, without descending into the depths of getting the roots in order to transcend. You have, in fact, sometimes I say it's necessary for us to descend before we can ascend.
Absolutely, and this is what Jung said. This was his whole teaching, that unless you reconnect with what's been lost, you're not a whole person. That was his major theme of his whole cosmology or philosophy. And he, right. A lovely quote here, which I will just give you.
Good.
Nothing to which the psyche belongs or which is part of the psyche is ever lost. To live fully, we have to reach down and bring back to life the deepest levels of the psyche from which our present consciousness has evolved. And that was the whole point of his process of individuation.
Right. Yeah, and of course Freud said something similar, but he only went deep enough to get into the instincts that were repressed sexuality within his culture. And it was people like you and Jung who said, yeah, there's that, but we have to go far deeper than our repressed sexual feelings and sensual feelings. We have to go deep into what Jung called the collective unconscious, and what you have called this vast array of electromagnetic fields. So let's talk about that for a moment.
Well, I like to tie it up with science, although I'm not a scientist, but the whole quantum discovery is actually bringing us into a new understanding of how everything is connected, just in the way it was in the culture of the Great Mother, when everything came forth from the Great Mother. Therefore, it was sacred. There was no division between the creator and the creation. And now quantum physics is giving us back this idea of the connection of everything. It doesn't speak of it in religious terms or spiritual terms, Nevertheless, if you look deep enough into it, you can see this is what they're saying, that we are in an utterly, utterly amazing, how do you call it? Well, web of life is too simplistic a term, really. I would say incandescent dimension of reality, which we're living in all the time without knowing it.
Mm-hmm.
We can't see it. We can't see these tiny, tiny, tiny atoms, or much smaller than atoms, but everything that we see and everything that we are is composed of these. And none of us is different from any other in that sense. And the bookcase behind me is composed of the same elements as I am. So that is a revelation, but it hasn't yet dawned on the world that this revelation coming from science could actually teach us something about the nature of reality and who we are. And we've worshipped God for God knows how many thousands of years, but it's dawning on us now that we are actually part of what we've been worshipping. And that was one of the great points I've made in my book in later chapters. But that really came as a revelation to me suddenly, that, good God, I'm part of what I've been worshipping and praying to, and I didn't know it. And this is extraordinary. And this is something which could connect all of us to each other without having to have all these dreadful divisions and separations.
Very well put. So I'm going to the chat a little bit now, and just encouraging everybody to go down to the bottom of your screen and click on chat and begin to raise questions. Amy Bloom raised one, and she said, "I'm desperately interested in Anne's latest thinking on her chapter, War as a Rape of the Soul." So if you comment on that, Anne.
Yes, because the book is being translated into French and Italian at the moment, and I've had to update the details of that chapter, and I've been just working on it last week, which has now been finished. Because to me, it's the greatest act of sacrilege to hold these weapons that we do and to go on building more and more of them in order to have this imaginary defense against some future attack, which may never come, but which Jung would have said we're continually creating the possibility of the attack by the fact that we're building more and more weapons. They will attract what we fear. So that chapter is very powerful, and it shows really how this habit of thinking has entered into all the governments, particularly the 9 nuclear powers. And part of that 9 nuclear power thing is this really the desire to dominate the world through these weapons. Because if you have these weapons, you think you're at the top table, you think you have the power over other people and other countries and species and whatever, when in fact you are going against the law of life. You are actually committing the greatest possible sin, and you are doing something truly demonic in creating these weapons. So I feel very strongly about this, and I've put all that strength of feeling into that chapter, and also the previous one on the shadow, to show how we're unconscious of what we're doing. We think we're defending our own nation, but in defending our own nation, we're actually threatening the lives of millions of other people who may be killed by one single hydrogen bomb, which we might set off or might inadvertently be sent off. I've discovered that there are 200 hydrogen bombs placed all around Europe as a defense against Russian attack. But they really put all these countries in Europe in great danger. So I'm drawing attention to this in that chapter. It's all there. I've only changed the details of the arms sales and the details of the number of armaments and hydrogen bombs, etc. So, and also this is what the great religious teachers like Buddha and Jesus and many others have said, that we are living in a sacred space and we cannot go against the law of life in continually creating these dreadful weapons, which have nearly gone off quite a few times. There was one at 1983 that nearly went off in Russia, except for the genius of the person in charge of it who realized it was an incorrect message. and he didn't send off the bomb that it was telling him to send off. So that's the sort of thing that we're up against. And I mentioned quite a few books in that chapter which are relevant to this whole thing. Also, I've discovered recently a wonderful book which I mentioned on my website under the title Nuclear Weapons and Absolute Evil, written by a professor in Denmark, an American professor actually, in Copenhagen. And he gives the whole detail. I would advise everybody watching or listening to get it. It's not difficult. You can download it from Lulu. And it will give the detail of how the whole thing of nuclear weapons developed, how each country, 5 nuclear powers became 9, what these bombs can do if they're detonated, how we'd have a nuclear winter, etc., which might destroy 3/4 of the life of the planet just with a few bombs. And all this is not known to the general public, so I'm making it known on my website as much as I can.
Thank you so much for that. And you embedded in your response, you said something like, one of the roots of evil is our urge to dominate. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, well, that is what it's about. How do we come from really realizing that we lived in a sacred planet to thinking that we could dominate the planet and dominate nature? This all came in through philosophy, through religion, because there were many religions that tried to subjugate other peoples in the name of God or in the name of Christ. And that whole mentality has gone into science. When religion sort of began to die off, and the death of God, as it were, in the 17th, 18th century, then science was just in the process of growing and becoming stronger and stronger. So it took on that mindset, if you like, of religion that had existed for a very long time. St. Augustine said way back in the 5th century, there's a just war. And that idea of the just war has been carried right the way through to our time, and to even Trump, who thinks it's perfectly just to still have all these nuclear weapons and build more nuclear weapons than he's got now, in case there is a just war in the future, which he will wage against some enemy. This whole idea of having to wage against an enemy is something that's come in with a polarization of what I call the solar age, when we had this split between spirit and nature. And that split has conditioned every other kind of thinking that has come to do with this weaponry and war and domination and control of nature. You wouldn't believe how many scientists still believe that, unfortunately, that is the task of humanity, is to control and dominate nature. But as I say, quantum physics is changing this attitude, so there's hope there. And there's also hope. I just want to mention, as a complete contrast to this, those boys that have been rescued in Thailand, because there you have the true soul impulse, the heart impulse of going to help other people and bringing them out of the most, well, really a living death, out of that terrible situation. They've given their lives, these SEALs who are helping bring out the boys, in order to rescue these 12 boys and their teacher. That is a great lesson to the whole world of really how we should be behaving to all peoples and all children and all situations where people need help and where love can come in. Because really, the actions of those very, very brave men is love. It's the expression of love for these children who are sort of abandoned there, who are also, the children are going through a shamanic initiation, a death and rebirth, which will undoubtedly influence the whole of the rest of their lives. And it'd be very interesting to know what they become as a result of that. I was thinking of that because they've really been, they thought they were going to die, all of them, and suddenly a light appears with a man behind it, and there's hope. They will not die necessarily, but there's great risk, and they have to go through this initiatory passage of getting out of that cave, which is very difficult and very dangerous and very frightening. So they've had to overcome their fear and actually follow the leadership of the older men guiding them and just trust life that they'll be taken out of there. It's very moving and very powerful lesson for the whole world.
Yes, it is. And thank you for that insight. We have these young boys and their mentor who are in the womb of Mother Earth.
Absolutely.
And there's been a pregnancy that we've all been through as we read about this experience.
And a delivery.
Yes, yeah. And as Stan Groff points out, they're being taken down the birth canal. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me, oh, I wouldn't want to go through that narrow space.
No, but we all have.
Yeah. And yet they're taking this, and yeah, Ruth on the chat says they are now all free in the past hour, the boy.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
What a miracle. And also what incredible courage and organization to make all that happen, and all the technology too that was necessary. If they hadn't had the oxygen, they never would have got out of there.
Right. And I think you're pointing to a deep underlying shamanic Jungian urge coming up from the earth that captures us, see, in this story. This is a part of the new story. This is a new birth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. That's exactly what you have to go through, this very narrow passage, in order to come out into the new story and be able to live it and understand it.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, that's what we're about in this conversation this morning, is birthing ourselves. Along that line, I think I also had this thought since I live in Texas, and I've been thinking about a series with interviewing the children of immigrants, since I have some access to that. I've got to figure out a way to do it without putting their parents at risk.
That's tricky now.
Yeah, but it's interesting how people high in our government can get all wrapped up in this story over in Thailand with these 12 boys and their coach. But right here in our midst is the birthing of the divine feminine that we have caged through this dominance that we have, this protectiveness that we have.
And the fear, it's based on fear, and it's based on survival instincts coming from fear. That's what's at the root of it all, is that we're still dominated by survival instincts rooted in fear.
Yeah, exactly.
If we're not in control, something terrible will happen.
For those of you in the United States, if you have a chance to go see the movie Would You Be My Neighbor, which is a story of a television personality, Mr. Rogers, in which his whole process is to bring out of the interior of children the deep feelings that they're having about life. And that's where our birth happens, I think, right now, as Anne, as we're interacting with you, is I have these feelings that are coming up. And one of them was expressed by Ruth in the chat box. She says, might you speak about welcoming these life experiences as teachers when they appear as, quote, psychotic breaks, schizophrenia, or madness? When they appear, at least to the mainline culture, to be a psychotic break or schizophrenia or some form of madness.
Yeah, well, there's nothing in the culture to receive people who are going through that state. And so they're branded or labeled as mad or psychotic, and they're given pills. There's nobody to listen to what they're actually saying. This wasn't so 40 or 50 years ago. This whole pill culture has grown up since then. Treating people for a manic depression or psychosis has increased enormously in America since 1990s. And since that time, although there's masses of psychotherapists, but they don't know the depths often. They haven't gone to the depths themselves. So they're terrified of the depths and probably hold them at bay and can't listen to the psychotic statements of the people that they might be treating. It's a very tragic situation, and it's all come about because of the defense against fear, really, and against difference and change. There was a wonderful man in California, a psychiatrist, I can't remember his name, it was a double-barrel name, and he took schizophrenic young people to his farm for 6 weeks, I think, and put them to work on the land. And being in touch with the land, they worked through their period of real psychosis and came out of it, and then were enriched by what they'd been through. So they didn't have to shut it away and be frightened of it and be ashamed of it or whatever. They could integrate it through his help, with his help. But I don't think that's been done anywhere else that I know of. Well, probably has been done, but I don't know about it. But that is a great loss, because so many young people, particularly 16, 17, 18, who are confused and frightened and finding the modern world difficult, and particularly social media difficult and intrusive and attacking them in one way or the other, they might go into a psychosis and not be given the help they need, which is really just to be in a peaceful place, in touch with nature, given some work to do, like growing something or planting something. And that in itself is healing and can bring them through. And they find then a value in their own life, in the relationship with the earth. Whereas before there was no value. They were just, as it were, lost in this world which has no roots, has no foundation, and no moral values whatsoever. Democracy is not a moral value, it's a concept. So this is something that the youth everywhere, all over the world, really needs help with, understanding of the value of their life above all, and to have the patience to wait, not to expect everything soon or at once sort of thing, but have the patience to grow into what they're capable of becoming. Takes many years, 50 years maybe, before you can become truly who you are. Mm-hmm. But if you lose it when you're in your teenage years and you're given antidepressants or whatever, antipsychotic pills, you may never come out of it. You may never grow into who you are. And that is a very great tragedy for the whole culture as well as for the individual.
Yeah, and you had both your mother and your grandmother to help birth this larger dimension in you.
Yeah, because my mother always held the values of the artist and the poet. So even though I was going into a very intellectual background in Oxford University, where I had to pass exams and everything, I never lost this other side. I was able to hold the two little by little, and particularly when I had the Jungian analysis, to hold the two together instead of them becoming split apart and one side completely lost or neglected, in order that the other side should, as it were, triumph or be superior. So I was very, very lucky. I was incredibly lucky to have such a wonderful mother, and also a very good father, a stable father who was very, very gifted, but tremendously hampered by his English upbringing.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of Jung's quotes, that the psychotic drowns in the same sea that the mystic swims in.
That's right. And there are probably many mystics in embryo in our culture that would benefit from somebody listening to them and saying, it's okay, you don't have to worry, don't be terrified. This is part of an initiation into another kind of a reality.
Yeah, part of our being a community here in this course, for example, nearly everyone, I think we have about 20, 25 participants now, 26, and nearly every one of us, since we have inside the child of the culture as well as the natural child, we have the child of the culture, the children of the culture inside of us. We wonder if we're crazy because we have these transordinary experiences. And a part of what we're doing at this very moment is saying, no, you're not necessarily crazy. What is needed is an elder to help bring you through the birth canal the way these children from Thailand were brought through the birth canal.
Yes, it needs an elder to earth people, to put them in touch with the life all around them, the environment, to find some way of connecting with the environment and serving the environment, maybe through animals, maybe through plants, maybe through trees, maybe through helping other people. I don't know what it might be for each individual, but some form of service and some form of connection with practical earth things, like even cooking is a tremendous help, healing help. Cooking is wonderful because you're working with matter and you're transforming matter with matter's help into something new or different. I've just been making some egg mousse for some friends who are coming to stay tomorrow, and working with that, with the eggs, you know, you turn the basic ingredients into something else, and this is alchemy.
Yes, yeah. Do you garden as well?
Now, I'm too old now to garden, but I still water the garden.
Yeah, well, that's key. And in fact, you early in your book, you talk about the dream of water.
The dream of the water, yes.
Just a comment or two about that.
Well, the dream of the water was very perplexing. We didn't know what it meant. But it was only when I came to alchemy that I understood that it's the divine water that we're all in. Mm-hmm. It's the water of the soul, the cosmic soul, not the individual soul, the cosmic soul, as well as the individual, if you like. But it's the divine water, what they call the divine water. And of course, that is the dream. And the dream of the water is that we should become aware of this. The water's dream is that we should know who we are and what we are, and relate to the spirit ground that we're in and serve it instead of abusing it and trying to dominate it.
Right. We have a comment from Rachel that says, nature is always holding up a mirror to our dysfunctional behavior. If we only knew how to understand symbolic language, she said.
Well, I think we're learning it. And also, you know, I was watching a fascinating program about a woman shaman in South Africa who can speak to the animals and who's learned to understand the language of the animals, even the language of a terrifying black leopard that was frightening everybody, and was called Diabolo, devil. And the leopard, speaking to this woman, said, "I don't like the name devil. Please think of another name for me and I'll be much happier." And so they called it spirit. And it changed its behavior and became docile and perfectly manageable from being totally ferocious. So that's understanding one kind of language, if you like. There's also the language of plants, which gardeners study and know a great deal about, particularly in this country. They're great gardeners. And we've had marvelous shows recently with people designing gardens and mountains of wonderful flowers. So that's another route to connect with the language. As you work with these aspects of nature, you learn the language and you learn to serve it in the way that you're doing, whatever it might be, me watering the garden at night to stop it dying or whatever.
Yeah, I wrote about that in a book called The Mother Tongue, Intimacy in the Eco Field. And that's really, I think, what we're called to do. That's a part of the lost language that you've said it so well. The lost language and is many facets of it, but one of it is just the ability to get to know in an intimate way different parts of our environment, like the garden and the plants and the leopards and the coyotes and so on and so forth, so that we actually can understand the language we can listen to rather than trying to dominate.
And also we can know that we're part of the environment that they also are in. We're not separate at all, as we've been taught, or as we feel we're separate, but we're not. Our actual atomic molecules, or I don't know what to call them, are connected with all the other ones that are around us. So we are connected without knowing it. So we just have to watch for synchronicities, watch for the kind of birds that come. One of the great problems nowadays is that so many people live in cities. So they're not in touch with gardens and with wild nature, mountains and rivers. If possible, everyone should go at some stage in the year to a place where there's a mountain or a river, just to connect with that wild nature, which we've become separated from. And that's much more easy in America than it is in England.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're really, all of us are a part of nature. We don't go out into nature. We are an aspect of nature.
That's right, yeah.
But there's what I call the outer bands of the hurricane of nature, which are dominated by humans, freeways, and so on and so forth. And then at the heart of nature is this wild, untamed part. And by that, I mean that dimension of nature that is not influenced that much by human beings. When we contact that dimension, then something happens to us. And I was hiking in Montana one time, and Judith and I came across a grizzly bear. And suddenly I realized the humility of humans when we are confronted with what we cannot control.
That must have been quite an experience.
Yeah. And I think that's, in some ways, Anne, I think your book is a primer on the forgotten language of relationships.
Yeah, I think that's lovely that you say that, because the whole feminine principle is about relationships, and that's what's been lost. The value of relationships, the value of the heart and the feelings of the heart has been lost with the too great emphasis on the rational mind and on intellect and developing the intellect. The heart has been forgotten, and the whole field of relationships, which is really the foundation of all our lives, that needs attention. But I think it's getting it now. I mean, a lot of people are waking up to this now, and there are many, many people in America, more than there are in Europe, I think, who are doing this, although Germany is also very much awake in this respect.
Yes.
And the Netherlands as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pause here for a moment, and then I want to come back to the new story on your website. But I want to bring in some people, and I see Linda Griebenow is here, and I wonder, Linda, if you're willing to bring a response into our circle today. Let's see if you can. Yes, there you are. So Linda is the new dean of the Wisdom School, so we're honored that this is your role of leadership with us, and wonder what your comments are today.
Oh my goodness, it's a good thing that I'm not in my pajamas viewing this. This little surprise attack here. Or opportunity, should I say.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm just absolutely overwhelmed in some ways with all of this wisdom that's emerging here. I was just writing a little note about this. I thought to myself, Pluto is doing its work, isn't it, these days? Those who are aware of the astrological or the mythological or the amazing energies of Pluto and the illumination of the underbelly of our human beingness. And I was still reflecting on the current experience, the stories that will be generated from this and that we're all making individually and collectively about the rise of the divine feminine in this moment, the need for the collaboration and cooperation, and for the awakening to the story that Anne and you have been talking about, all different aspects of that. But I was thinking, it's amazing, isn't it, that in the that the illumination of our shadow parts, those pieces that are unresolved, those pieces that we are faced with that are being brought to the surface, that Pluto's being relentless. We will not be left alone. We must decide what it is that we're going to do to bring ourselves to a higher level of consciousness and acting through love in the world. And so we have this culture in Thailand where there is a particular value that suggests that 12 children are worthy of the sacrifice of an individual's life. They're worthy of being brought to the surface. Their lives have meaning, and no cost is spared. They are in struggle with nature for and against what they're trying to do. And in this country, at the same time, what's happening is we are jailing children. We are separating them from families. We are sending 1-year-old into court to represent themselves, calling that due process, I guess, in some way, shape, or form. And so there's still this issue, isn't it, about what it is we value and who it is that we believe ourselves to be. And I love what you have been talking about, which is that when Anne said, you know, all of those years she had been, in all of the years of our humanity, we have looked into the concept of God and worshiped something as if it was separate from ourselves. And then in some places now these days, we are discovering that that is who we are, and that there is a divine within all of us that is being asked to, you know, to take the lead, that idea to take the lead, that we are what it is that we are looking for. We are who it is that we have been searching for all of this time, that divine spark within us. And out of that darkness, I'm hoping that these days, that the illumination is brighter and brighter, and that we find our way through that guiding light that's within each one of us. We have to determine who it is that we are in relation to all that it is that we believe. And this is such an important conversation in this moment, and such an important time for this conversation to be being held. And I'm really grateful and thankful that I can be a part of this wisdom that's emerging today. Grateful and thankful for this work that Anne Baring has put forth, and the work that you have done, Will. And I'm inspired and encouraged. And so I wish to continue to hear from you and all of the others who are on this call today. Thank you for allowing me a moment here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us. And we're together in this. We're in one circle. And so I wonder, also going back to the chat box for a moment, there was a comment earlier of gratitude, and for on page 179, your meditation on the body.
Body,
We haven't really talked much about the body. So what is
the whole body? What it suffered under Christianity was just unspeakable, both from the priests and theologians who used to torture their body, thinking that they would make them come closer to God, and also from the treatment of the body and all the treatment of the heresies and the burning at the stake and the crucifixions and the tortures, and I mean just unbelievable things that Christians did to the body, thinking that they were doing the work of God and the work of Christ. That is a terrible karmic debt that we have, that we need to get rid of, or not get rid of, but be absolved from, if you like. So I felt very strongly about the body, and the body is a miracle. When science has discovered the miraculous nature of how everything works together, how all the organs in the body depend on each other. There's no one that is superior or more advantageous or whatever. And the heart is the organ which really has an influence on the brain more than the other way around. So there are many things that are being discovered, and particularly by somebody called Bruce Lipton, who's doing a course at the moment on all this, and how his life was changed by discovering the miracle of the body and the biology, really, of the body. So there are people like him who are bringing through this new thinking. And America is extraordinarily rich in all these people. I mean, I can't count them on the fingers of a hand. There are hundreds of people, if not thousands, in America. You never hear about them in the media because the media is concentrating on power. and who's in power and who can come into power or get out of power. So you don't hear about this substratum of incredible teachers who are in America. And I get all the time the Shift network sending me things, which I can't do because I haven't got time. And there are other things as well. So I think there's great hope. There's a complete split in the American psyche between this mystical, integrated, connected psyche and this terrible political psyche, which is only interested in power and how we can get more of it, and in the treatment of the children, which is absolutely shocking and against all the instincts of the feminine, really. In us, the heart instincts are simply not allowed to be heard in that stratum of American society. And Trump at the moment embodies them, but he embodies other things as well. You never know what he's going to do next, like his meeting with Putin. We just wait and see what happens there. So there's tremendous hope as well as despair over the shadow side. And I think, coming back to what Linda is saying, that there's more hope in a way, and something is shifting in the collective psyche now, as exemplified in these boys in Thailand, but also in the football. Because football, the World Cup, is bringing together young men from every country in the world to meet each other, to compete with each other without actually killing each other, although there's some rough work in some of the games. But that is bringing together all the youth, as it were, so that it's going to be more difficult for the youth in one country to send bombs to another or to fight another. And we may come to a point where young men just say, I'm not doing it. I'm fed up with all this army business. I'm resigning. I'm not going to fight for my country. I'm going to serve the planet instead.
Yeah, you're pointing to, you and Linda both are pointing to what Jung called the golden shadow. And in some ways, it's more difficult for us to own our possibility and potential and hope and love than it is to own the darker impulses. So just a couple of comments about the golden shadow.
Well, that's a lovely term. I hadn't actually come across that in Jung, but thank you for telling me about it. Well, I think the golden shadow needs strengthening. And if people in America came together more and shared all these different organizations that are working together with the indigenous people in New Mexico or Nevada or in Montana or Santa Fe, who are coming, people like Chief Phil Lane is a marvelous teacher. I've got all his teachings written down here from having done a shift course with him. And also someone called Chief Arvol is another one, who's head of the Lakota people. So you have in America these great teachers among the indigenous people. And really, if you spread their teaching among all the schools, if you can, or your university, that would be one of the things that would be a tremendous help. People would have respect, people would listen, and children particularly would listen. Apparently there's a children's book on the sayings of Chief Seattle, which I've just ordered from the internet to give to a child nearby here. So you have books there too, which you can give to children and teach them about the need to look after the planet. And this will grow, this golden shadow will grow, because you can't fight the dark shadow. You can only fight the dark by bringing in the light and becoming the light, as it were, without, you can speak about the shadow and deplore it, but there's no way that you can get rid of 1,500 nuclear bombs in America, or however many they have, and so many in Russia as well. You can't go and dismantle them. So you have to do other work, which is to do with being true to the golden shadow and being sure that you have a work to do and not just trusting yourself, not saying, oh, well, who am I to be doing this? Who's going to listen to me? Just do what's in front of your nose and follow it day by day, and follow your intuitive insights and trust them. Don't doubt them when you have them. Follow them.
Good, thank you. Then we had from Ruth a comment in the chat. What about getting some Native elders to join the conversation with the immigrant children? Yeah.
That would be fantastic. Yeah,
it's a great idea. I'll take that into advisement. I want to, as we come to the last few minutes, I want to come to your very perceptive summary on your website. In 1988, you were introduced to Thomas Berry's notion of the old story and the
Well, I think that Thomas Berry influenced on me, and in fact, naming my book "The Dream of the Cosmos" was following his book "The Dream of the Earth," and the elements of the new story to me are, first of all, we have to relinquish the old story. We have to relinquish the idea that we're sinful beings. When we die, that's the end of us. We have to change our image of death. That's one of the parts of the new story that I'm focusing on a lot, because we don't die when we die. We go on to other dimensions, and we come back to Earth thousands of times, or possibly to other planets where there's where we've lived before or will live again. So changing the image of God is one. Changing the image of death is the second thing. But it's all on that awakening to a new story, awakening to the understanding that we're all connected, that we're not little separate little bits split off from nature or split off from each other. We have a deep feeling connection underneath, which will come through more, I think, as the new story gets going. The actual phrase "new story," other people are using it. It's not unique to me, but I'm using it a lot in my teaching and my talks now, because I think people need an image of this new story. They need to feel that there's something they can connect with, something that will give them inspiration and courage, and also the ability to act, because now is the time to act. The time for assimilating ideas is finished now. We need to act, and in whatever way we can, to help the earth and help each other and help those poor children who are really just treated as detritus. It's really appalling. So that's all part of the new story. And I put there the scientific discoveries, I put that into that article on the new story. And I've also put a most beautiful poem from the Essene Gospels, which is actually, Jesus was an Essene, and his teaching came from the Essenes. And in that beautiful song or prayer that I've put there is the essence of really Jesus's teaching about loving the earth, knowing that we are divine beings. That's another thing, very important. We carry divinity within us. And if you go to the first chapter of the Gospel of John, you'll see that we all carry a light. It says, "A light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world." It's all there, but it's never been taught. Christianity has never taught that we carry this innate divinity, and we need to bring it forth in caring for the earth and caring for people, for animals, caring for every aspect of life that we're living in the midst of. So that to me is the essence of the new story. Certain very salient points that need to be put out now, and I am putting them out. I've got videos I've done which are on YouTube speaking about this.
Yeah, and as we come to the close of our time together today, you and I are at that stage of life when death is much closer than at other times, and you put forth in your understanding of the new story a very pregnant sentence that really death is a word that we use to describe a process, and the process is cyclical, as you are describing. And is that a feeling that's coming from deep inside of you?
Absolutely. And I'm not afraid of death, but as I get nearer to death, I get more and more ability to speak out, because I'm not afraid of speaking out, because I know I won't be around for long. I can't be punished for what I'm saying. And I look forward to moving on, and also meeting all the people who've helped me write that book, who I often feel around me, and who certainly helped me, sending me the books I needed at the particular time I needed them, and helping me all along the way, really. So you can call that guidance from the spirit world, if you like. But we move into the spirit world, and we don't know where we're going exactly, but it will be all right.
Yeah, I like what you said there, and I feel something similar. The older I get, the closer I am to death, the less I really care about professional consequences.
That's right. Yeah.
So we really appreciate your willingness to put your truth out there so clearly and to speak with a transparent clarity, actually, about your vision in the world today. And next month we'll proceed with this in a cyclical way. Jim will be interviewing you, and we'll go at this whole vision from a different perspective that I think everybody will appreciate. I just want to return to the chat in the last few minutes. Sheila says, much gratitude, Anne, for your luminous presence and deep wisdom. Your message resonates deeply with me. And then Amy Bloom says, I feel the glow of your great gifts. And then Dr. Joy from over in Atlanta says, thanks, Anne, for your inspiring book and your divine presence. And really, that is really kind of the essence of your quest for the soul, isn't it? The golden shadow is owning that we are a divine presence.
Yes, but you have to go carefully with how you tell people. I think I noticed there was one remark saying you can't go around telling everybody they're carrying this divinity. You have to judge your audience. You have to be sure that you can speak without either upsetting, offending, or terrifying people.
Yeah, good. Maybe we can close with a statement from Linda Griebenow. She says, there's no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. Yet, as we know, to make the attempt is part of our wondrous and terrible vocation.
That's right.
We're called in this broken world to open ourselves to the beauty that persists, to allow ourselves to see and be stunned. She's quoting Thomas Merton there.
Yeah, lovely.
So Anne, thank you so much. I can't tell you how deeply I appreciate and experience the connection we have as we talk, and my heart swells to be with you.
Thank you, Will. Well, you make it possible for me to reach a wider audience and to understand what I'm writing, which is absolutely marvelous. And so thank you. And our connection is very deep now and long-standing. So I'm very, very grateful for that.
Good. Thank you so much. And next month, you'll be receiving notices. And Anne, I'll talk to you. I'd like to explore this notion of the divine water a bit more with you, but I'll do that in an aside.
Okay.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us from all around the world. Faranak from Europe and Germany and the UK, and then that terribly foreign country called Texas. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.